August 17, 1942. 2 hours before dawn in the black water of the Central Pacific, the surface of the ocean split open above two American submarines. The USS Nautilus and the USS Argonaut, running silently for 6 days from Pearl Harbor, rose to periscope depth off a low coral atoll in the Gilbert Islands called Makin. On deck in the dark, 221 United States Marines began climbing into rubber boats, their faces blackened, their weapons wrapped against seawater, their orders simple and brutal. Land on enemy soil, destroy everything of military value, kill or capture the Japanese garrison, and vanish before the Imperial Japanese Navy could respond in force. This was not a rescue mission. It was not a defensive action. It was one of the first offensive ground operations undertaken by American forces against Imperial Japan since the attack on Pearl Harbor 8 months earlier. For a nation still reeling from a string of defeats across the Pacific, Wake Island, the Philippines, Guam, the raid on Makin was meant to answer a single urgent question. Could American forces strike into Japanese-held territory, fight, and survive? The stakes were larger than one atoll. 1 week earlier, on August 7, United States Marines had landed on Guadalcanal, opening the first major American ground offensive of the Pacific War. That operation was fragile. American forces held a narrow perimeter around an unfinished airstrip, and Japanese reinforcements were flowing south through the Solomon Islands by the thousands. Any diversion that could pull Japanese attention, aircraft, or troops away from Guadalcanal, even for a matter of days, had real strategic value. Makin Island was that diversion, and the unit assigned to carry it out, the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, would become, in the space of 36 hours, one of the most talked-about fighting forces in the United States military. The men who fought there would be remembered less for tactical success. The raid, in strict military terms, achieved only partial results and more for something else: a reputation for ferocity, unconventional tactics, and a willingness to fight past the point where conventional forces would have withdrawn. That reputation reached the Japanese garrisons across the Central Pacific long before the raiders themselves did. This is the story of how that reputation was built on a small, forgotten atoll in less than 2 days. To understand why the Makin Raid mattered, it is necessary to understand the state of the Pacific War in the summer of 1942. Japan had entered the war with a series of stunning military successes. Within months of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japanese forces had seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and a vast arc of Pacific islands, including the Gilbert Islands, which Japanese forces occupied beginning December 9, 1941, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor. American and Allied forces had been almost entirely on the defensive. By mid-1942, the tide had begun to turn, but only barely. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May and the Battle of Midway in June had halted Japanese naval expansion and inflicted serious losses on the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier fleet. But on the ground, Japan still held enormous territory across the Pacific, and American planners had no experience conducting offensive amphibious operations against a prepared or even lightly defended Japanese position. No American unit had yet been organized, trained, or equipped specifically for this kind of warfare: rapid strike, sabotage, and withdrawal, conducted far from friendly lines with minimal support. Conventional Marine infantry battalions of the period were built for sustained operations. They moved with heavy equipment, extensive logistics trains, and armor and artillery support. They were not designed to be inserted by submarine, to operate for a single night without resupply, or to fight without the expectation of reinforcement. The existing military doctrine of the United States Marine Corps had no template for a unit that needed to be, in effect, disposable and self-sufficient, able to strike and disappear before the enemy could bring superior numbers to bear. At the same time, the American public and the American military badly needed a victory, any victory, that could be presented as evidence that Japanese forces were not invincible. The string of losses in the first 6 months of the war had damaged both military and civilian morale. A successful raid deep into what was presented as secure Japanese territory would carry propaganda value far beyond its tactical significance. This was the vacuum into which the concept of the Marine Raider Battalion was born. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion was activated on February 19, 1942, and its formation and philosophy were inseparable from the personality of the man who commanded it, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Fordyce Carlson. Carlson was an unusual figure for a career Marine officer. Before the war, he had served as a military observer attached to the Chinese Communist Eighth Route Army during its campaign against Japanese occupation forces in northern China in 1937 and 1938. There, Carlson studied the guerrilla tactics and internal command structure of Mao Zedong's forces, and he was particularly struck by a practice the Chinese called gung-ho, roughly translated as work together. In communist units, officers and enlisted soldiers discussed operations, strategy, and grievances together in open sessions, with an emphasis on shared purpose rather than rigid hierarchy. Carlson brought this concept back to the United States Marine Corps, and he built the 2nd Raider Battalion around it, holding regular gung-ho meetings in which raiders of any rank could speak freely, question orders, and propose solutions to tactical problems. Carlson's executive officer and second-in-command for the Makin Raid was Major James Roosevelt, the eldest son of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt's presence in the battalion was, in part, a product of direct presidential interest in the concept of American commando forces, inspired partly by British commando raids on occupied Europe. His participation also guaranteed the operation a level of public attention that few other small-unit actions in the Pacific would receive. Other key figures in the Makin operation included Captain Gerald Holtom, the battalion's intelligence officer, who spoke and read fluent Japanese and was responsible for interrogating prisoners and translating captured documents, and Lieutenant Oscar Petros, who commanded a 12-man squad that landed separately from the main force due to confusion in the pre-dawn surf, an accident that would prove strategically significant. On the Japanese side, the Makin garrison in August 1942 was commanded by Sergeant Major Kanemitsu, leading a detachment of the 62nd Guard Unit. American intelligence before the raid was poor. Planners estimated the Japanese garrison could number anywhere between 50 and 350 men. In fact, the actual defending force was fewer than 50 men, a fact the raiders would not discover until the fighting had already begun. Before the Marine Raiders existed as a formal organization, American military planners had struggled to design any unit capable of the mission that Makin would require. Conventional Marine and Army infantry units, structured for large-scale amphibious assault and sustained combat, were unsuited to a hit-and-run raid launched from submarines. Standard landing craft could not be carried aboard a submarine. Standard infantry battalions were too large and too equipment-heavy to be inserted covertly. Early proposals for raiding operations against Japanese-held islands were shelved for lack of a trained force and lack of proven submarine-based insertion techniques. The concept of using submarines to insert small raiding parties was itself unproven for American forces at this scale. The USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut, the 2 submarines used for the Makin Raid, were among the largest in the U.S. Navy's inventory, but neither had been designed to carry troops in this manner. Both submarines required significant modification, including the installation of external fittings to secure rubber landing boats to their decks, and neither modification had been tested in a live combat insertion before Makin. Rehearsals for the raid, conducted in Hawaii in the weeks before the operation, exposed serious problems. The outboard motors intended to power the rubber landing boats through the surf frequently failed or could not be started in rough water, forcing raiders to paddle by hand, a problem that would resurface catastrophically during the actual landing and more severely during the withdrawal. Navigation in darkness proved difficult, and coordination between multiple landing boats attempting to reach a single beach at night in poor surf conditions could not be reliably rehearsed to the standard commanders wanted. These were not failures of courage or planning intent, they were the practical failures of an entirely new form of warfare being built from nothing, in a matter of months under wartime pressure. They meant that when the raiders finally launched their boats off Makin in the early hours of August 17, they were still, in critical respects, in unfamiliar territory. The tactical innovation of the Makin operation was not a single weapon or invention, it was an entire operational concept. The submarine-launched commando raid, conducted by a specially organized light infantry force trained for independent action, sabotage, and rapid withdrawal, without any expectation of reinforcement or heavy support. The mechanics of the plan were as follows. The 2 submarines surfaced roughly 500 yards off the western beach of Budarattari Island, the main island of Makin Atoll, under cover of darkness. Marines climbed from the submarine hatches into 18 rubber boats, each fitted with a small outboard motor, and paddled or motored toward shore. Carlson had originally planned to split his force and land on 2 separate beaches to attack the Japanese garrison from converging directions. In the confusion of a night landing in rough surf, this plan broke down. Carlson made the decision to consolidate his landing on a single beach, but Lieutenant Petros's 12-man squad, already in the water, did not receive word of the change and landed separately, exactly as originally planned. This accident became the raid's most effective tactical maneuver. While the main raider force, landing together, encountered stiff resistance from Japanese snipers and machine gun positions as they pushed inland from the western beach, Petros's small, isolated squad found itself, by pure chance, positioned behind the Japanese defenders. Advancing inland alone, Petros's men killed 8 Japanese soldiers, destroyed a machine gun position, and disabled the garrison's radio equipment, cutting off, at least temporarily, the Japanese ability to call for reinforcement. Meanwhile, the main raider force, advancing under Company A, crossed the island from the western beach to the northern shore before turning to attack southwest into the main Japanese defensive positions. Japanese forces, heavily outnumbered, launched 2 banzai charges, direct frontal assaults, intended to overwhelm the attacking force through shock and close-quarters violence. Both charges were destroyed by concentrated raider rifle and automatic weapons fire, and in doing so eliminated the majority of the remaining Japanese garrison in a matter of minutes. At 1:30 in the afternoon, 12 Japanese aircraft, including 2 large flying boats carrying reinforcements, arrived over Makin. The raiders, armed with rifles, machine guns, and Boy's anti-tank rifles, a British-designed weapon issued for use against light vehicles, and when necessary, aircraft on the water, opened fire on the flying boats as they attempted to land in the lagoon. One flying boat was shot down outright, the second burst into flames. The remaining Japanese aircraft strafed and bombed the island but inflicted no American casualties. By the end of the day, the great majority of the Japanese garrison, a force numbering under 50 men, reinforced by no more than 35 additional troops during the fighting, had been killed. The Makin Raid was not a laboratory test. It was the first live combat validation of the entire Marine Raider concept: submarine insertion, night landing, independent small unit action, and self-directed withdrawal without external support. The raid also validated, in a much darker sense, the risks inherent in the concept. On the afternoon of August 17, with communications disrupted, ammunition running low, and uncertain of the size of the remaining Japanese force, Carlson and his senior officers momentarily believed the operation had failed and that withdrawal was impossible. An attempt was made to communicate a surrender to Japanese forces still on the island, an episode that remains difficult to fully reconstruct, in part because the Japanese soldier who may have received the surrender message was killed by a Marine before it could be acted upon, and in part because official American accounts of the incident remained limited for years afterward. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the surrender attempt did not proceed, and the raiders instead prepared to fight their way off the island under cover of darkness. The withdrawal, planned for 7:30 that evening, quickly became the most dangerous phase of the entire operation. Many of the outboard motors on the 18 rubber landing boats, the same motors that had caused problems in pre-raid rehearsals, failed in the heavy surf. Marines were forced to paddle by hand against breaking waves, and several boats capsized or were swamped, throwing men and equipment into the water in darkness. Some boats had to make repeated attempts across multiple hours before successfully reaching the submarines waiting offshore. 7 Marines drowned during the withdrawal, a loss driven not by enemy fire, but by the same operational fragility that had plagued the raid from its planning stages. 9 raiders were left behind on Makin when the submarines were finally forced to depart, their absence not discovered by the withdrawing force until it was too late to return. These 9 men were later captured by Japanese forces and in October 1942 executed on the island of Kwajalein, a war crime documented after the war during post-war tribunals, and one of the clearest examples of the lethal risk faced by any American serviceman captured during raiding operations of this kind. Despite these losses, the raid was publicly presented, and to a significant degree genuinely regarded within the Marine Corps as a success. It had demonstrated that American forces could insert by submarine, strike a Japanese-held position, destroy its military value, and inflict disproportionate casualties on the defending garrison. Lieutenant Colonel Carlson received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the operation. The tactical lessons of Makin, both its successes and its serious failures, were absorbed quickly into the broader development of Marine Raider doctrine and equipment. The unreliability of outboard motors and the danger of night surf landings led to significant changes in raider training, equipment maintenance procedures, and rehearsal standards for subsequent operations. The value of small, independently operating units, demonstrated almost by accident through Lieutenant Petros's isolated squad, became a deliberate element of Raider tactical doctrine going forward, reinforcing the idea that flexible, decentralized small unit action often outperformed larger, centrally coordinated assaults in the confused conditions of night amphibious warfare. By the time of the Makin Raid, the Marine Corps had already organized a sister unit, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, which had landed on Chalagi in the Solomon Islands just days before Makin, fighting a 24-hour battle against Japanese defenders and suffering 45 Marines killed while inflicting more than 300 Japanese casualties. Together, these two operations, Chalagi and Makin, served as the combat-proving ground for the entire Raider concept in its first major test. Following Makin, Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion was deployed to Guadalcanal, where in November and December of 1942 it conducted what became known as the Long Patrol, a grueling 30-day operation deep behind Japanese lines that resulted in more than 500 Japanese casualties, while demonstrating the Raiders' capacity for sustained, independent operations far beyond a single night raid. Eventually, 4 full Marine Raider battalions were organized into a single regiment, and Raider units participated in the broader island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific through 1943 and into 1944, including operations in the New Georgia Campaign at Inagay and Barroco, and later at Bougainville. Raider units became associated with early experimentation in camouflage uniform design, specialized small unit weapons loadouts, and unconventional tactics that would later be studied by the broader Marine Corps. The strategic impact of the Makin Raid, judged strictly against its stated objective of diverting Japanese attention and reinforcements away from Guadalcanal, was limited. Japanese military planners did not withdraw meaningful forces from the Solomon Islands campaign in response to the raid, and in the raid's immediate aftermath, Japanese forces actually reinforced and fortified their garrisons across the Gilbert Islands more heavily than before, anticipating further American attacks. But the raid's impact extended well beyond its narrow tactical outcome. For the American public and for the broader United States military, Makin was reported and celebrated as a clear example of Marines striking successfully into territory the Japanese had held since December 1941. Newspapers across the country ran extensive coverage of Carlson's raiders in the weeks following the operation, and the battalion was informally granted its own battle song within days of the raid's conclusion, an unusual honor for a single battalion-sized unit at that stage of the war. For the Japanese military, the raid carried a different kind of significance. It demonstrated that American forces were now capable of conducting offensive operations against previously secure rear area garrisons far from the main battle lines, a capability the Imperial Japanese Command had not seriously planned to defend against in the Gilbert Islands. This forced a reassessment of garrison strength in coastal defense across the wider Central Pacific, contributing to a broader pattern of Japanese overextension as forces that might otherwise have reinforced frontline positions were instead redirected to defend rear area island garrisons against the possibility of further raids. The raid also carried a harder, more sobering impact. The execution of the 9 captured raiders on Kwajalein became, after the war, part of the documented record of Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, contributing to the broader post-war understanding of the extreme risks faced by servicemen captured during Pacific Island operations, and to the post-war prosecution of Japanese officers responsible for such acts. The Marine Raider battalions themselves were disbanded in early 1944, absorbed into the newly formed 4th Marine Regiment, as the Pacific War shifted toward large-scale, conventional amphibious campaigns that required different force structures than small raiding units. Internally, the Marine Corps leadership of the period remained ambivalent and in some cases openly skeptical about the value of a permanent specialized raiding force operating outside standard infantry organization, a debate over the identity and independence of Marine special operations that would resurface decades later. Evans Carlson himself continued to serve through the war, later commanding a regiment during the invasion of Saipan in 1944, where he was severely wounded shielding another Marine from enemy fire. He retired from the Marine Corps in 1946 and died in 1947. For nearly 6 decades after the Second World War, the Marine Corps maintained no permanent, dedicated Special Operations Command of its own, relying instead on the argument that all Marine infantry units were inherently special operations capable. This position began to change after the September 11 2001 attacks and the subsequent global war on terrorism. When the Marine Corps launched a pilot program in 2003, Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command Detachment 1, to test the integration of Marine units into United States Special Operations Command alongside Navy SEALs and Army Special Forces. The program's success led to the formal establishment of Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command, or MARSOC, in 2006. Initially, MARSOC did not carry the Raider name. The Marine Corps had rejected requests to use the title in both 2006 and 2011, reflecting the same institutional ambivalence that had shaped the Corps' relationship with Carlson's and Edson's units 60 years earlier. In 2014, under Commandant General James F. Amos, the Marine Corps formally reversed this position, redesignating MARSOC's operational battalions as the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Marine Raider Battalions, along with the Marine Raider Regiment and Marine Raider Support Group, explicitly reconnecting the modern force to the legacy of the World War II units that had fought at Chilagi, Makin, and Guadalcanal. Today, Marine Raiders headquartered at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, are recognized as a Tier 2 Special Operations Force, operating alongside Army Rangers and Navy SEAL teams in direct action, special reconnaissance, and counterterrorism roles across multiple theaters, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, and the Philippines. Carlson's original gung-ho philosophy, emphasizing open communication between ranks and decentralized, critical decision-making under pressure, remains an explicitly cited element of modern Raider training and selection, described within the command as the foundation of what is now termed the cognitive Raider concept. An operator selected as much for adaptability and independent judgment as for physical capability. The problem that faced American military planners in the summer of 1942 was, at its core, a problem of doubt. Doubt that American forces could strike successfully into territory the Japanese had held since the earliest weeks of the war. Doubt that a specialized, lightly equipped unit could be inserted by submarine, fight independently without reinforcement, and withdraw before an enemy could respond in strength. Doubt, held by much of the American public, that the string of defeats since Pearl Harbor could be reversed at all. The raid on Makin Island did not resolve every one of those doubts cleanly. It did not achieve its stated goal of diverting significant Japanese forces from Guadalcanal. It cost the lives of Marines who drowned in a failed withdrawal, and of 9 men who were captured and later executed. Its command decisions, including the surrender attempt on the afternoon of August 17, remained a subject of quiet controversy within the Marine Corps for years afterward. And yet the raid answered the larger question it had been sent to answer. American Marines had landed on Japanese-held soil, destroyed its military value, killed the great majority of its defending garrison, shot down enemy aircraft attempting to reinforce it, and returned home, imperfectly, at real cost but decisively. For a Japanese military command accustomed to 8 months of near-uninterrupted advance across the Pacific, Makin was a signal that the war had changed. Garrisons once considered safe now had to be defended. Rear areas were no longer rear areas. The initiative, in ways both practical and psychological, had begun to shift. More than 80 years later, the raid endures not primarily as a tactical case study, but as the founding action of a lineage that continues in active service today. The men who wear the title Marine Raider in the 21st century train under a philosophy first carried back from a communist army in northern China by a Marine lieutenant colonel who believed that soldiers fought better when they were trusted to think. That belief was tested at cost on a small coral atoll called Makin on a single night in August 1942, and it has outlasted every one of the men who carried it ashore.